Hi guys, Brian here from City Back Pain Program. So, deadlifts and lower back pain. Should you do them? Should you avoid them? Will they cause problems? Will they help your rehab? The simple answer is it depends, as with all things in life, let alone lower back pain. It really does depend on your situation, your injury, your level of movement quality and control, so that you can have a decent deadlift technique, but also the type of deadlift that you pick as well, because there are more than one type of deadlift technique. There's a few of them. They've all got positives and negatives, as with most things, attached to them, and it's just kind of balancing the trade-offs between the different techniques and trying to find the one for you which is the safest and most effective. In terms of long term, whether you should be doing deadlifts or not, again, it's very personal to your situation. My suggestion would be to balance the perceived risks for you versus the perceived rewards. So I'll give you two examples. Say you're just the average person who works in an office and doesn't really want to necessarily get big and muscly or super strong, and you don't really compete in powerlifting. Do you need to be doing powerlifting? Do we need to be doing deadlifts? Probably not. You could probably get a similar effect for your hips in terms of just working on basic hip hinges, movements such as glute bridges, single leg, Romanian deadlifts, maybe kettlebell swings might be a better option for you because you've got a lot less risk, but you are training the same movement and building sort of muscular endurance in the glutes and the lower back. However, you might, for some reason, perhaps you're into, your goal is hypertrophy, you pack on as much muscle as possible, or perhaps even you compete in, weightlifting or powerlifting, and you need to be able to have a strong deadlift technique because that's either part of your sport or it's a foundation for the movement that you need to do. In which case, the perceived risk then is definitely, outweighed by the reward that you need for your particular circumstance. But again, that's very personal. As a general rule, for most of the guys that I train, I usually start with building a half-decent squat first. And while we're building the squat, we'll look at glute bridges, single leg glute bridges, single leg Romanian deadlifts, kettlebell swings, those sort of things. And then if they want to, then once they've got that foundation with the hip hinge movement, then I can progress them onto some sort of heavy deadlift from the floor. But then again, which way we go and which type, again, it depends on the person, and I just adapt it to suit their situation. So what I'll do in here, rather than looking at, in this video, specific deadlift technique, because there's a million videos out there and most of them will be better than what I'm going to do in 5 minutes, I'm going to look at a few different variations and just give you ideas of things that you can try around a deadlift technique that may reduce the risk for you and make it a little bit easier so you do get the reward without the danger of smashing your back to pieces. So, first deadlift technique is probably the one that most people use, most common type that people see as well. This is what we call like a traditional deadlift setup. So in my traditionals, your feet are usually about hip width or shoulder width apart, and your arms come outside your knees. So when you come up to the bar, you basically want to get your shins to touch the bar. You're going to come down, your arms in tight to the side of your legs, pop your knees out a little bit. Try and get your back as straight as you can. Pull into the weight a little bit. Braces on. Stand up. And down. So that's probably the most common type. Some people generally think of, deadlift that does my back in. That's the type they think of. So what's the problem with the traditional deadlift that I see from most people? I mean, I'm assuming that you understand how to brace, how to set your shoulders up, get things tight before you try and lift off the floor. But, and I must admit I do suffer from this a little bit, is when I'm set up here, because of the structure of my hips, it feels very awkward with my feet being this close. Like I'm kind of limited to how low I can go before my sort of the bones at the top of my legs in my thighs hit my thigh bones, close up that socket, and I just don't feel like my back's a bit exposed here, like it's got a tendency to try and round at the bottom. So even though I'm nice and tense and taut, because I'm in that kind of weakened position at the bottom, just puts a bit of risk on my lower back, in the muscles and the discs as well. So then as I stand up, what I find is that I have to sort of straighten myself as I come up. So what that does is that when you've got a heavy weight and you're generating what we call movement through the disc as you come up for the deadlift, that's when it becomes a high risk for causing a problem. So obviously, to counter this argument, guys that have seen people like Eddie Hall and top deadlifters that set world records that deadlift with this type of technique, if you watch them, they've got a very slightly rounded upper back, but not the lower back. And you'll find if you watch their technique from the side in slow motion, it pretty much, once it's locked, the upper back's locked slightly rounded, it basically stays like that. And that's how they sort of generate tension in their body so that their hips can, and their legs can get and the lower back can get the weight off the floor without rounding the lower back. So what we've got to do with this is distinguish that if you can't do this because of flexibility or control issues without rounding your lower back, this is probably not the best version for you, or not from the floor. So what we can do is we can raise it up a little bit, take off that risk and put you in a stronger position. Because what we want to do, the best deadlift technique really is to be in a really strong position to get that weight off the floor, so basically your posture doesn't change as you come through. As soon as you're a bit weakened, you have to kind of get into a strong position as you move. That transitional period is when you're going to put, your back and your discs at risk. So all we have to do for this is really just raise it off the floor. And what I'll do in the next video, I'll just raise it off the floor a little bit, and I can find for me that I'm in a much stronger position. Even by raising it by an inch or so, I feel in a much more confident position that I can lift without doing any damage to my lower back. Traditional deadlift stance, what I've done, I've just raised it up. In this case, we use some 20 kilo Eleiko weight plates, just to raise it up a sort of 1.5 inches or so. But even for me, in this position here, like it just feels better on my hips. If my hips feel good, then it's easier for me to get the back set. I don't feel so exposed in that lower back because of it. So if you find that traditional stance deadlift is probably the best option for you, again, you've got lower history of lower back pain, you can reduce the risk just by raising the bar a little bit off the floor with some weight plates or some risers. And again, just keeps you in a stronger position, keeps that back safer, keeps that posture kind of static as you go through, so you can just kind of lever the weight up without putting pressure on your disc. So another option we've got is to increase the width of our stance, either into a full-blown sumo stance or into some sort of hybrid between sort of regular and wide. So what this means is that you're at this time round, so your arms being here, your arms are going to come inside your legs, and that affords you the ability then to adjust the stance to suit your hip structure and what feels best for you. So we'll say a full-blown sumo deadlift, you'd go super wide with your toes turned out, and then set up here. So what this does is it puts a lot more of the work into the legs, and you can definitely feel from here, like I can feel my hamstrings, my adductors are screaming because they're being stretched out, but it affords me a safer position because I can get low, but all that tightness is in the hips and the legs. It doesn't feel like it's in the back, and I can lift from here and come up. So for me, that personally is way too wide. I don't really like it, it just feels a bit weak. So what I do is I tend to come in a little bit, more of a hybrid, and this seems to work a bit better for me, and it kind of matches what I do with my squats as well. So from here, you come in, and the setup here is much the same. You just want to try and keep, my advice would be try and make sure you keep your shins as vertical as you can, and then kind of set the weight up. We'll use the weight of the bar to set the weight into your hips. And come up through the legs as much as you can rather than lower back. So I find for me that there's two things, that technique. One, at the bottom, I can get low and close to the weight, but my back's nice and straight. I don't feel like I'm kind of exposed. But also, I'll give my hips a monumental stretch. So that for me kind of undoes the time that I spend sat down either working on a computer or looking at a phone or watching TV or whatever. It kind of forces me to keep my hips kind of flexible and stretched out, which for me is one of my triggers. If my hips get tight, I know eventually my back's going to complain about it. So if I can train in a gym in a way that keeps me strong and mobile, then that's going to be better for me. It might be better for you. But again, with this, if you've never done like a sumo stance before, it's going to feel bizarre. tight, very uncomfortable. That's why I'd say with each technique, try them for at least a month, get a feel for them, and that way you can be a bit more objective about whether they're going to work for you or not. You kind of get a feel for it. But this, definitely, this will test your hip flexibility. But for me, it feels best because I feel like the weight's in my legs. I don't feel like I'm putting too much weight from my lower back, which it doesn't like. I can heft, a decent amount of weight. But again, there's no sort of risk of injury for me on this one. Okay, so the last deadlift variation or possibility I'm going to look at today is what we call a trap bar deadlift. So I'm not sure what a trap bar is. It's that. For some reason, this seems to be the most popular go-to. If someone's got back pain and they still want to deadlift, for some reason, this one's been sort of seen as a bit of a panacea for that sort of work around that problem. Unfortunately, because of the mechanics of it, sometimes long-term, it can make long-term issues far worse. So if we look at the technique first of all, so we're going to stand inside the middle of the bar. So for this variation, I'm going to use a high bar, high handle variation here. There are handles below as well. This is generally the safer one, I guess, for most people. So from here, you set up, drive up, and then down. So the reason I'm not a big fan of these necessarily for people with back pain is because the width of the bar is now dictating how wide we can get the legs out. And also because of the nature of the way you're carrying the weight, it tends to make the deadlift very quad dominant. So you tend to see a lot of people when they lift with this weight, they'll get that kind of knee valgus like they would do with a squat. They'll kind of lift, things will buckle in and then pop back out again. That's usually a good sign that someone's trying to use their quads to do a deadlift on this. So probably one of the most common muscular imbalances I usually see with people with back pain is because they're always trying to spare their back and trying to avoid bending, but by doing so they kind of avoid trying to hip hinge all the time. They'll kind of squat to get things off the floor and they'll be very quad dominant all the time because they're trying to use these instead of using their back. The trouble is with this is short term, it feels good because you feel like you're not really exposing the back, but long term, obviously depending on people's hip structure and the way they move, you could be ingraining that quad imbalance and making those quads tighter and more dominant. So they want to keep using these all the time to kind of control their hips rather than developing a nice stable hip hinge. The other thing is as well is just ego. It's generally a lot of people find it easier on this to lift more weight, especially with the high handles, rather than trying to figure out a way of getting down to a lower bar on the floor and trying to work for their tight hips. So it depends, but generally I find a lot of people who've got back pain already very quad dominant anyway. They've got very bad hip hinge mechanics. This seems to make it worse for a lot of people, but that's not everyone. And the way to tell for you really is to try each of the three options I gave you today, see what works best for you. So what you're looking for is obviously, you feel strong off the floor, you can get tightness in the right places, you can get your brace on, hips feel good, feel in control of the weight, and obviously you can lift a half decent amount of weight and not feel that your back's exposed either during the workout or after, like you've done a bit too much work on it or you've aggravated something. But again, really just sort of try them for a month and see what works best for you. Again, trap bars, I'm not a fan of it because you're kind of limited. Your stance options are limited because of the nature of the bar. My preference for guys with lower back pain, if they want to get into deadlift, 9 times out of 10 I'll move them towards some sort of sumo or a hybrid stance with a regular bar because it forces them to stretch the hips out and work on kind of their tight spots rather than trying to work around it like you would do with a trap bar. But that's 3 different options. Give them a try, see what you think. Again, deadlifts aren't necessarily for everyone, but if you feel like you want to do them or if you need to do them for your sport, there's 3 sort of different ways to think about them and 3 different approaches to try.